Hello, my name is Paul Spiteri, and to help celebrate The Man Who Met Tarzan, Meteor House's collection of farmers' Tarzan writings, I'm going to recite two passages from extracts from the memoirs of Lord Greystoke. In these passages, Lord Greystoke uses abbreviations and there are also a few redactions. I think the abbreviations will be pretty obvious to this audience, and I'll use the word redacted to indicate any missing words. The first reading describes how his lordship was able to claim his title. F constructed a highly romantic and grandiose lineage for me in his biography. He claims to be more of a realistic writer than B, but he is a romantic who clothes his fantasizing with the trappings of reality. He could have told more of the true story in his biography without disclosing my real identity, but he couldn't resist the temptation to gild the lily more than a little. However, I am in Burke's peerage, though not under Greystoke, of course. I am descended from the historical Barons Greystoke and related to the Howards. But that can be said of hundreds of people, or, for all I know, thousands. There was only one way I could have gotten the title and the money without publicity. Nor do I know why B did not tell the real story in his account of how I became redacted. Perhaps he felt the publication of the novel was too close in time to the real events. He may have felt that somebody might have investigated and have been lucky enough to detect the fraud. After all one had to do was to reread the English newspapers of a few years back. However, he would have not found that a young English redacted had been shipwrecked off the coast of Africa and, after some hardships, had been rescued. T's yacht, contrary to what B said, was only disabled, not sunk. On the other hand, my father had been on a secret mission for the British government, and when he and his wife disappeared, the government gave out a totally misleading report, so I can't be tracked down through that account. Even if some determined person did come across the proper clues, he wouldn't find me. I have already faked my death, nor would he dare make a public accusation. He would be laughed to scorn and undoubtedly sued by my family. B has done me the inestimable favour of establishing once and for all in the minds of the public that I am a purely fictional person. Half of the events told in B's second novel had their parallel in reality. It is not true that J was abducted by men who would have had to trail me across half of Africa if B's account had been true. Actually, though, I did find that lost city, those cold lairs inhabited by a few survivors of an ancient Caucasian people, that rose-red city half as old as time, before I returned to the west coast. I was not to visit it again until some years later. I did find my cousin dying on the west coast, and he told me how he had been aware that I was the true heir, but had concealed it from J. After he had died, J told me what would happen if I stepped forth to make my claim. I would never know a moment's privacy while I lived in the civilized world. I wouldn't either, J said. As your wife, I'd be subject to just as much publicity. Then I won't claim it, I said. No, she said, you have a right to it. She looked at her dead fiancé and said, we've commented on how much you look like him, so... My cousin was only an inch shorter than I and had an athlete's physique. His features were much like mine, which wasn't surprising considering that my grandfather and his father were brothers. And he had the same black hair and grey eyes. Technically, it's illegal, she said, but it's not a criminal fraud. You wouldn't be getting anything you weren't entitled to. So that is why we buried him there and journeyed up the coast to where the rest of the shipwreck party was. Nobody there who knew my cousin was fooled, of course, but after Jay had explained what I was going to do and why, they agreed to keep silent. D was the only one from the French ship that rescued us who knew my identity, and he thought that the deception was a splendid idea. N remained to be dealt with. He would have been glad to keep silent too if I would pay him blackmail. Of that we were all sure. But he had no idea that my cousin had died, and we did not tell him. He was put in the ship's brig and turned over to the French police at Marseille. I returned to England as my cousin. We were taking a long chance, though not as long as it might seem at first sight. My cousin had been out of England for a year, taking a sort of grand tour before he went to Oxford. He was only 19 and hence might reasonably be expected to have grown another inch in a year's time. The scars on my forehead and body could be accounted for as a result of the accident to the ship and the jungle hardships. Since I am a gifted mimic, I had no trouble imitating his voice, the timbre of which resembled mine somewhat in any case. His parents were dead, and he had seen no close relatives for years. The servants at the ancestral hall and the villagers nearby were a sticky problem. But they were described to me, their photographs shown if available, and I was filled in on them by my third cousin, Lord redacted. He was, as B said, a member of the party, in fact the owner of the yacht which had sunk. He was marrying Jay's best friend, and he was very sympathetic when he heard my story. He furnished me with all the information he had about the servants and the villagers. He also told me as much as he knew about my cousin's friends and his schoolmates. He had gone to rugby too, though he was 3 years ahead of my cousin. He had kept in contact with him after school. They ran in the same circles and belonged to the same clubs. Still, I was bound to run into friends and relatives of my cousin about whom I would know nothing. So it thought best to pretend that I had suffered partial amnesia as a result of the shipwreck. This story got me through a number of difficult situations. The servants and the villagers must have thought that my African experience had made me rather odd. But if they suspected that I was not who I was supposed to be, they did not brew it about. About a year later, N escaped from the French prison. He looked up his old crony in crime, P, and they came to England. Why, I don't know. But somehow they found out that I had taken my cousin's place. They were in a position to blackmail me and would have done so if they had not known that I would kill them regardless of the consequences. Instead, they kidnapped my baby and Jay and carried them off to Africa. Jay was to be sold to some desert sultan, and my son was to be raised as a savage. In this respect, B was correct. But much of the third novel is grossly exaggerated, and many things he describes never happened. My son died of a jungle fever. N was killed, much as B describes. P escaped, but was never heard of again, though B used him as a character in the fourth novel. I imagine he died in the jungle shortly after escaping. And that is how I was able to claim my inheritance with only a few people knowing that I was not my cousin. Okay, in my second passage, Lord Greystoke tells us about the tribe he grew up within and gives us some information on where they might sit on the evolutionary tree. I'll apologise up front for my pronunciation of Tarzan's tribe, particularly the Nkay. One of the criticisms of B's story was that there was no such creatures as his language-using great apes. Thus his novel had to be sheer fantasy, as much modern mythology as Kipling's A Jungle Book. The great apes had not been discovered by reputable scientists and hence could not exist. This criticism came only 12 years after the discovery of the okapi, the existence of which had been scoffed at for years by scientists. The pygmy elephant and hippopotamus were also supposed to be a mere fable of the natives, but more than one zoo now exhibits them. There have also been rumours for years of a small maneless spotted lion existing in the forests of Kenya and Uganda. The existence of these is denied, but I have seen them. Whether or not any specimens will ever come to the attention of the scientists is another matter. They were never very numerous, and they may now be extinct. The point I'm making is that scientists have been wrong. They are perfectly correct in refusing to acknowledge the existence of such creatures until proof is presented of their existence. But too many scientists and educated laymen have denied that they could in fact exist, and that is an unscientific attitude. Bee's critics denied that any unknown species of ape could exist in Africa. They also scoffed at Bee because his apes ate meat. Chimpanzees and gorillas don't eat meat, they said. Therefore, no apes, even of the mythological variety, are carnivores. It seems to be true that gorillas are pure herbivores in their natural state, but Goodall has shown that chimpanzees in the wild state do eat meat whenever they get a chance, and it is known that baboons, which are monkeys, also eat meat. The truth is that Bee and his critics were half right and half wrong. There is a species of primate which has not been discovered by the scientific community, or there was at least. I saw them several times during my childhood and youth, but they may be extinct now. It is this species which has given rise to tales of the Kenyan Agogwe and the wild men observed in the eastern, central and western areas of Africa. They are about 4 feet high and very hairy, but they walk upright. Hence they are not apes, not in the scientific sense. Their pelvic girdles and feet are so similar to men that they would have to be classified as some species of Australopithecide, creatures halfway between ape and man. I doubt that they are the missing link. It is more probable that they are a cousin of the creature that was in the direct line of man's ancestry. In any event, I have seen them, though I never had any direct contact with them. They fled my tribe as quickly as they did humans. My own people are, I believe, another species of hominid, or perhaps a giant variety of the Agogwe. They are not missing links either, but cousins of man. They are not the great apes described by Bee, but they do or did exist, and it was among them that I was raised. Bee was not given any clear description of them, and so he visualized them as gorilloids. He had them using a language which was correct. But in his novels, he also attributed language use to the gorillas and monkeys. While it is true that the higher primates can communicate more effectively than zoologists believe, they do not have a language in the human sense. They use signals, not verbal symbols. It was lucky for me that the Unka were language users. If I'd been raised by true apes, I would have passed the mental stage beyond which language learning becomes possible, and I would have not been much better than an idiot. Authentic cases of feral humans bear me out in this. If the child has not experienced a human language before the age of 5 to 8, or perhaps earlier, he becomes incapable of learning language. So in a sense, I am not a true feral man. Those who raised me were quite capable linguistically, and their capabilities for learning other things were higher than those of any animals. Bee didn't know this. After learning the truth, he was forced to continue the original description in order to be consistent. Not that he cared. He was a storyteller, not an anthropologist. I have said that my people were possibly a giant variety of Paranthropus. Giant is a relative term here, since the tallest was actually only about 6 feet. When I'd attained my full growth, I had 3 inches on the tallest, Old Kachuk. He didn't like my looking down on him, and this was one more thing to make him hate and fear me. But he was much stronger, and if it hadn't been for my father's knife, I would have been killed when he finally challenged me. Bunker looked hairy, though this was because their body hair grew to a 4 or 5 inch length and was as coarse as a chimpanzee's. The numbers of hairs were actually less than that of humans. The breasts of both male and female were innocent of hair. Both had short, bushy beards and stiff head hairs not more than 2 inches long. The Inca head was long and low, bread loaf shaped. They had very little forehead, and the supraorbital ridges of the adult male were almost as massive as a gorilla's. A bony crest, like a gorilla's though smaller, ran from the front to the back of the skull of the males. These were necessary to support the massive chewing muscles. The nose was not quite as flat and as wide-nostrilled as a gorilla's. The ears were close to the head and shaped exactly like a human's, but about 1/4 larger. The jaws were prognathous, about halfway in protrusion between man's and the gorilla's. The lips were not the thin lips of the chimpanzee and the gorilla. They were as fully everted as the average Caucasian's. The teeth were large, fitted for grinding the tough silicious roots or cracking the nuts which formed a large part of their diet. Contrary to B's description, they did not have the long canines of the gorilla. The teeth were quite hominid, the molars having 5 cusps in a Y pattern. A primatologist would see at a glance that they belonged to a creature nearer to man than the apes. The palate was not quite as arched as that of the human. The jaw seen from above formed a bow shape, unlike the U shape of ape jaws. The head was carried further forward than that of the human. The pelvis was not as efficiently shaped for walking as the human's. The legs were shorter in proportion to the torso than the human's, and they were less straight. The feet were flat, and there was a wide separation between the big toe and the other toes. The arms were somewhat longer in proportion to the torso than those of a man. The hands were larger and thicker than a man's. The thumb was shorter and thicker in proportion. None of the tribe could come near my manual dexterity. Their muscles are not only more massive than a human's, but superior in quality. Even the smallest female is much stronger than the greatest human weightlifter. The muscles are attached to thick and dense bones. My own skeleton is denser than that of any modern man's. I attribute this to my feral life, to unceasing activity and hard exertion. As I understand it, the bones of the early caveman were also denser due to his exceedingly active life. Their hair colour varies from a dull black to a russet brown. The eyebrows are very bushy and black. Their eyes are russet brown. Their skin, coffee with 3 spoonfuls of cream. Like most rainforest dwellers, they don't have any need for many sweat glands. Their body odour differs from that of man. The English language does not contain the vocabulary items needed to describe it accurately. I can only say that to a keen nose, it has elements both of the odour of Homo sapiens and of the gorilla, with an indescribable element that is unique to them. Their anal excrement is softer but more adhesive than that of Homo sapiens, and not nearly as offensive. This, I presume, is because their diet is largely vegetarian. Their urine, curiously enough, reminds me of a civet cat urine, yet I would not mistake one for the other. Unlike the gorilla, they do not foul their own nest. When one has to defecate, he retreats to some distance from the free feeding ground. This seems to have nothing to do with modesty. A number of adult males and females and children will retreat at the same time to the same place and there relieve themselves side by side while chatting away without embarrassment. Nor do they leave the feeding area to urinate. Their sense of smell is keener than that of Homo sapiens, but not nearly as keen as a dog's, whose sense of smell is estimated to be 1,000,000 times sharper than man's. B has exaggerated my own olfactory powers. They are not as strong as the Inca's. though they are superior to any human I've ever met. But this is a matter of training. And after I've been in a city for a while, it becomes comparatively deadened. A good thing too. During my first few days in a city, I became nauseated with the many offensive odours that exude from man and his artefacts. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I didn't mangle some of the pronunciations too badly. The full article, along with plenty of other Tarzan-related gems, are in the book, The Man Who Met Tarzan, available from Media House. Take care and goodbye.